In the beginning, there was darkness. Then, in most stories of how the cosmos starts, your favourite god or goddess does something and light eventually turns up. Except when it doesn't, which was usually when night occurred and the moon was placed in the sky. But then there were other times when it went dark. And that was when there was a solar eclipse. And because solar eclipses happen during the day, by their very nature, then this was considered, by very early societies who knew little about the cosmos, a strangely terrifying phenomenon, often used as a foreshadowing of death and doom and other disastrously destructive words beginning with D. This fascinating feature of nature has influenced myth and legend and folktale, and I'm here to tell you about some of this folklore and whether by analysing different cultures' narratives we can determine the root and origin of these stories. Why am I telling you this? Well, my name is John White and I'm a specialist in Indo-European mythology and a curator of the Mythology and Folklore database, a dataset used by thousands of academics and hundreds of universities across the world in the study of myth and legend and folktale. So they can use that to find the origins of our stories and traditions and beliefs that now seem long lost to us. And so today in this video, we will look for where the stories that talk of the mysteries of the sun and solar eclipses to see how and why humans across the ages have explained these events and the consequences of such explanations. So, if this sounds interesting to you, then grab yourself a cup of tea and welcome to Clackenford. One of the most common themes in mythology are those of the sun and the moon. And if we look at the Mythology and Folklore database, we see that the very first set of motifs in the Bereskin catalogue relate to this. So those that begin with the letter A. Here are stories of multiple suns being chased, the moon and the sun fighting, the moon being eaten, the sun being eaten, and sacrifices and monsters, and the sun being afraid of the moon, and all sorts of weird cosmological stuff. Now, whilst we know how and when eclipses will happen today, as we have an excellent understanding of the solar system, and as an aside, over the next few years, we will see plenty of eclipses. You may be under the impression that predicting these events actually must have only happened recently, and in a way you're right. We have only been able to predict them with gravitational position, since Isaac Newton is said to have had an apple fall on his head. But before this, various civilizations found various ways to predict eclipses and other cosmological events to varying degrees. The Greeks used geometric modelling and the Babylonians had empirical periodic prediction. Despite this European and Near Eastern bias, or seems to be bias, we do see predictions about eclipses made in various cultures across history throughout the world. The Dresden Codex, for example, was created by the Mayans and sometime between the 11th and 12th centuries, and shows a 405-month lunar cycle which was used to track all sorts of things in the heavens. But the Babylonians, their periodic predictions arose as they were keeping astronomical diaries as far back as the 8th century BCE, and these tablets implied the discovery of the Saros cycle, a 6,585.3 day cycle, which is about 18 years and 11 days, which describes the frequency of solar and lunar eclipses and how they repeat in geometric sets. But the very earliest record of an eclipse we have is from China, from the Book of Documents, the Shu Jing. And within this, there is a legend about how the eclipse was not predicted, which allows us to tell us that they were predicting them. And the story goes that during the reign of Emperor Zhong Kang, the fourth ruler of the Zhai dynasty, the brothers Si and Ho were the directors of the Board of Astronomy. Their role was sacred. They were the mediators between the Son of Heaven, who was the Emperor Zongkang, and the celestial movements of which were thought to be influenced by dragons. His and Ho were responsible for the ritual calendar, and so when agriculture and religious sacrifices would be made, they would let people know. And on the first day of the last month of autumn, an unpredicted eclipse occurred. This was perceived by the Zhai dynasty as a sign of cosmic disorder. Musicians beat drums to drive dragons away that were consuming the sun. Bureaucrats travelled quickly to sacred places to make ritual sacrifices. And the general population panicked, as for them it was too late for rituals. The emperor sent for Si and Ho to demand an explanation for this eclipse, and the brothers were found drunk, very, very drunk, enjoying the fine life that their position had given them, and, well, were in complete ignorance of what had happened. It was deemed that by failing to announce the eclipse, they had misled the emperor and endangered the spiritual safety of the state, and so the emperor sent the Prince of Yin to administer a punitive punishment. They were given the sentence of statutory death for those who were ahead of the time and statutory death for those who are behind the time. They were basically beheaded. So, whilst this story is almost certainly not historical and was probably written to teach officials not to be incompetent, modern astronomers have calculated which eclipse was being referred to, as we know the rough geography and dynasty at the time. And this is traditionally said to be dated to 2134 BCE, although this is disputed by some scholars. But if it is true, then it would be the first ever story of professional malpractice we have, and also the earliest potential record of recording an eclipse. And the power of the eclipse to represent danger or bad omens is not uncommon. In Mesopotamia, during the first millennium BCE, eclipses were treated as omens that kings would die. Luckily, the omen wasn't specific about which king, and so what they would do is they would have this process where they would introduce a substitute king during these times. And when the bad omen was over, the substitute king would go to their fate. And if that wasn't bad enough, the substitute king would also have a substitute queen who would also go to their fate at the same time. Now, there is a passage called "The Substitute King Should Go to His Fate," which explains this. And it goes like this. To the king, your servant Adad Umu Uza. Good health to the king. May Nabu and Marduk bless the king. Concerning the substitute king about whom the king wrote to me, how many days should he sit on the throne? We waited for a solar eclipse, but the eclipse did not take place. Now, if the gods are seen together on the 15th day, he may go to his fate on the 16th. Alternatively, if it is agreeable to the king, my lord, let him complete 100 days. And so we see here that the substitute rulers sat on the throne for up to 100 days to absorb all the bad juju from the solar eclipse, and then they were killed, probably by sacrifice. But that whole process is rather ambiguous. But this is interesting because all of the bureaucracy around it, and probably some secrecy as well going on, that the elite felt that the eclipse was some strong supernatural power, yet the process around it was debated. But if we move further west into Europe, we see an evolution of how the sun and the moon are perceived. Within the Old Norse book of the Prose Edda, where Snorri Sturluson writes of the Gylfaginning, the story has the wolf Skoll pursuing Sol, the sun, and Hati Hrothvitnison, who pursues the moon, whose name is Mani. The moon is Mani. So, the destiny has been sown in these stories that implies that the wolves will catch these solar objects. They will catch what they chase, which implies that the bodies are not used as timekeeping elements in myths. The society wasn't using the moon and the sun really as a calendar, but the myth is explaining why these objects move across the sky. It feels like a purely visual explanation of what is happening. But behind it, there is a suggestion that one day the light may disappear when the wolf catches its prey. And this is particularly noted in the story of Ragnarok from the Volaspor, a poem discussing the creation and end of the world, a cosmological poem. Here, the sun and the moon are said to be stolen from the sky by the wolves Skoll and Hati. And as an aside, the wolves Skoll and Hati are said to be fathered by Fenrir, the wolf who was fathered by Loki. And Fenrir is the wolf who, well, basically eats Odin, come Ragnarok. And as an aside, Fenrir was also originally probably another name for Loki. And I have videos about that, which I'll try and find and post here somewhere. So, but yes, poetic simplification basically says that Fenrir's wolf, referring to Loki's son, as he gets then named Fenrir. But yes, so watch the video. So back to the story. Either way, the wolf swallowing the moon and the sun must be considered a terrifying experience for those watching it from the ground, especially if you think it's a giant wolf that has done this. This story is thought to refer to the daily cycle of the sun and the moon, saying that they disappear at the end of the world as well. But it's ambiguous enough for it to be considered applying to an eclipse as well, suggesting the walls are closing in, which may explain why some considered it a bad omen and one foretelling that the end of the world was nigh. Now, this myth of the walls is relatively well known, but it is not the first myth we know from this region about the sun. Amongst some Bronze Age razors we find in the British Museum, there are some that show a mythology of the sun alongside some boats. They're really small razors, and there's a British Museum video. I'll link it down below where they've enlarged them to show some of this. And these figures on them, this narrative on them, is showing that the boats with the sun have been icons of mythology in Scandinavia for thousands of years. And if we look at the famous petroglyphs at Fossum, there are many pictures of boats and the sun. This imagery has given many scholars food for thought, and perhaps the most well-known is Fleming Kaul, who has carried out the most work on this, looking and comparing the images. Now, what he's saying is just a hypothesis, sort of a theory. We can't prove this, but looking at what he's written, it seems as though older mythology has boats taking the sun across the sky. Sometimes one boat, but there are also twin boats in many pictures. We see ships turning around in the underworld at the end of the day, with the mythological narratives painted showing these ships turning, going facing east one way, then facing west, and then as they go back into the night to come back again. So basically, the ships go across the sky, east to west, and then they've got to go back west to east and to do the day again. So basically, they've got the boats going one way, turn around, going the other way, and then come the other way to the underworld. And whilst the story about this is no longer with us, it looks as though the horse has been carrying the sun in myth since the Bronze Age, since we were riding horses almost, or thereabouts. And because that would make sense, if people start to use horses for transport, and it was such a great thing, then surely the great horse would be transporting the great sun. So basically, during the day, the boat has to sail under the sun to collect it, and if we place an eclipse in a story, it must be because the sun horse has landed early on the ground. But say the story is lost, so we don't really know. But the premise is the horse is carrying the sun. The horse could land on the boat, and the boat helps it travel. It's got to be a complicated story, or perhaps the horse is after the boat, but it doesn't look like it because we see horses on boats. So, yeah, say it's lost. But there is a very similar sort of myth, or iconography at least, in Egypt, where they had night and day ships, and on those ships travelled Ra, the sun god. And during the day, Ra would travel across the sky, shining and seeing, but at night he entered Duat, which is the equivalent of the underworld, the other world in mythology. And the Netherworld books of the New Kingdom, the Book of Gates, has information about this, and there's also information in some of the pyramid texts. And the Egyptian mythology talks about the sun being born again every morning in the east, where it sets out on its journey across the sky on a boat known as a bark. But at night, much like the old Norse story, it doesn't die. It goes through the western gates on the horizon, enters the Duat, and there things are more dangerous as it crosses the underworld, and it must rely on protective power and allies to successfully navigate this realm. And with that, the sun becomes renewed and can spend the day shining again as it travels across the sky. And so, much like the old Norse, there is a lack of specific information about solar eclipses, which is sort of odd considering how much they were talked about in Mesopotamia. And we know the influence between the two, but there's certainly isn't any stories I'm aware of in Egyptian mythology about the sun going dark. But with its journey in the night, it does suggest that the sun is vulnerable, as forces are acknowledged as being able to disrupt the sun. Now, there is a mention in the New Kingdom narratives of a chaos serpent, the great serpent of chaos, often referred to as Apep or Apophis in the Greek translations. And this serpent, although in early texts it does not necessarily take a serpent form, is said to want to halt, devour, or paralyze the sun god. This doesn't make that serpent a god, but it is a serpent that be considered in a way a little bit like Tiamat, in the sense that it's primordial, and we just imagine it to be a serpent, but is a monster or this being, this other force, an anti-solar figure, though. And we also have often quoted a story that lies between Scandinavia and Egypt, where in Greece we have a prediction of a solar eclipse going back to what we believe would be the year 585 BCE, or that is what some scholars believe it refers to. And it's found within Herodotus's histories, where it is written that after the Elates and the Caesares have been waging war inconclusively, came to pass at an encounter in the 6th year that just when they had engaged a battle, the day was suddenly transformed to night, which sounds like an eclipse. Thales of Miletus had predicted to the Minoans that this transformation of the day would take place. Now, we have no evidence that this is true or how Thales would have predicted this, although to some scholars, if he had, he probably would have used Mesopotamian calculations, saying that there was an eclipse in the region in 585, but Thales, or more, to be more precise, Herodotus's writings on him do not mention a location in the prediction, just a year, not even a day. So there is probably still a lack of understanding of predictability of these events at this time in Greece. Although within 100 years, in 478 BCE, the Greek philosopher Anaxagoras identifies the cause of the eclipse as the moon blocking the sun's light. And so the Greeks are well on their way to calculating eclipses with greater accuracy by them. Now, the best evidence we have for an eclipse in a story is that of Thucydides, who wrote about the history of the Peloponnesian War, that a lunar eclipse happens as the Athenians are preparing to retreat from Syracuse. Now, there, when the eclipse happens, General Nicias halts the retreat to await ritual purification, believing the eclipse to be a bad omen. The result is that the army is, well, destroyed. It served as a cautionary tale in Greek and Roman history. And if we then travel further afield and go to the Americas, in the First Nation tribe in Northwest America, close to the Nass River, we see a totem poles, or there are many totem poles in North America, in the First Nation tribes, and they relate to narratives. And there's one which talks about the sun and the raven. And this story basically goes that long ago, Raven wandered south through a world of darkness, looking for food, and wherever he went, beings wished for daylight. And Raven learned that the sun, moon, and stars were owned by a great chief at the head of the Nass River. He went to the chief's house and transformed himself into a pale hemlock needle and was swallowed by the chief's daughter. And then he was later born as her child. And as a baby, Raven cried until he was given the moon, which he soon tossed in the sky. And then he cried for the box that held daylight. And when it was finally given to him, he seized his chance by taking the box and flying away. And then he filled the world with daylight. And when that happened, those people or beings wearing animal skins became animals, and the rest became human. And thus daylight was brought to the world. Now, that story may be about the sun and daylight, but it shows an acknowledgement of cosmic thievery within narratives, and this could have been described or used to describe what happened to the sun if it disappeared. And we do find in the Numa culture, who on the west side of the Americas, a specific tale about an eclipse called Tok-Tu-Gwok, which tells of a great black snake that tries to swallow the moon when it wanes, and the moon is so large that the snake cannot swallow it and ends up burning the snake's mouth. and it spits it out after a short time. So, in effect, emulating the effect of an eclipse. And all these stories, all they have in common is, they think eclipses are bad, and they try to describe where they came from in many of them. But we see in the Rig Veda, a hymn which is often referred to as Trita Apcha 101.104, which has a number of interpretations, one of which is that it is a charm against a solar eclipse. And that theory was written by a chap called Lutfiana in his 1959 work for Luna. And it's basically because the poem talks about the cosmos and how it feels like chaos, and then it returns to order. But there are many other interpretations saying it is actually a poem about sacrifice and whether sacrifice is really worth it. But I'll read you a few verses here just so you can make a self-informed interpretation. But I'll just take sort of 4 verses out of the poem, the ones that will really make a difference. The moon is here in the waters, the fine feathered one runs in the heaven. They do not find your track, O lightning bolts with golden fillies. Take heed of this speech of mine, you 2 world halves. You gods who are yonder in the 3 luminous realms of heaven, what is truth for you? What is untruth? Where is the age-old offering for you? Take heed of this speech of mine, you 2 world hearts. These fine feathered ones sit in the middle, on the stairway to heaven. They keep away from the path of the wolf that is overtaking the boisterous waters. Take heed of this speech of mine, you 2 world halves. Heed this speech of mine, you 2 world halves. Because the reddish wolf has suddenly seen me going along the path. He rears up on having noticed me, like a carpenter with a stitch in his side. Take heed of this speech of mine, you 2 world halves. With this song may we, with Indra on our side and possessing hail heroes, be preeminent in the community. This let Mitra and Varuna grant to us, and Aditi, river and earth and heaven. Many of the stories I've told today are old, relating to religions and societies that are now long in our past. But we do some interesting views from Islam, the youngest of our larger religions today. Here we see a number of narrations of Sahih Bukhari, which cite that the sun eclipsed on the day Ibrahim, the prophet's son, died. The event of the eclipse and the death were linked here by many people. But we find narration from Muhammad that denies the 2 events are linked. He goes, the sun and the moon are 2 signs among the signs of God. They do not eclipse for the death and life of anyone. And which states that eclipses are explicitly denied as omens of death or royal fate. And he offers prayers to support this view. Here we see religion pushing back against the older superstitions that religion still keeps the ritual, though, whilst removing the traditional logic people applied to the omens. So I've tried to tell you a number of stories today about the importance of eclipses and the power of the sun as an important aspect of cosmological tradition. But we also see science trying to explain this for thousands of years. We've seen stories evolved in a landscape that changes in the sky. We also see stories that seem similar from across a wide region. We see monsters consuming a sun that is pulled by a boat or a horse. And it would be very simple to look at these and say that they are related because they have consistent motifs. But these motifs are so common and so broad, being chased by a monster using transport to move, that to try and do any phylogenetic application on these myths wouldn't be quite impossible, but it would be a very difficult task indeed. Yes, we see very localized versions of stories which influence other local communities, but these cannot be traced to an original story by one particular group. My opinion, based on my experience of narrative dispersal across the globe, across human history, would be that these stories were already embedded in human culture before the last significant dispersal of humans from Africa 55,000 years ago. And considering where these stories are found today, I think it would be hard to argue against this. The stories are told everywhere now about something that has been going on for as long as humans have been around, then there is very little to say these stories were not being told before modern humans left Africa. Those stories were probably existing and being told, and perhaps was a creature in the sky consuming something to do this. Although the movement of the sun is strange, because what we did probably have some access to water transport, but whether that was carrying the sun, we don't know. We don't have those narratives that I'm aware of in Africa. But considering all that, to try and find that original story then, because of the lack of narratives we have that we can date in Africa, is a challenge. Yeah, we can say that, to say, there's probably a monster or predator has swallowed the sun, which was probably the original myth, but that would be honestly purely speculation. Although we can have some confidence in it, we can't ever prove it. And we must remember that these partial eclipses, so whilst eclipses are quite rare, full eclipses, partial eclipses happen in most places every 2 or 3 years. And so people say were seeing these potentially throughout their lifetime. And they'll probably be far more aware of them than we are today, certainly in areas where the weather is far better than Northern Europe, where I live. And so, to sort of conclude, the eclipse, this persistence, is an important event that helped the story continue. Perhaps, in a very similar way to we see of the flood narrative. It has a very widespread nature. Floods do persist, but they only became important later on in human culture when there was more sedentary behaviour and you couldn't move away from them. Again, the flood myth is a much younger myth, and I talk about why I believe that would be a younger myth in this video somewhere. Yes, so we know we can be very confident the flood myth started to happen as an evolution from a primordial myth of the world being water after humans left Africa. The eclipse, we just don't know. What I would say is that eclipses must have been noticed as long as we've been looking at the sky. When something so bright, so important disappears, it probably was your most well-known monster that did this. Yeah, until science showed us it was just a shadow show in the cosmos. So I hope you enjoyed that walk through these narratives. If you like my work, please consider becoming a YouTube member or a Patreon member. I don't have sponsorships in these videos, so if you could press subscribe or like, it's free and that would help me tremendously. And if you do join Patreon or as a YouTube member, you will support my work, certainly with the mythology and folklore database, which helps, to say, people and in this field do further research. So thank you for watching, for your support, for clicking like. And until the next video, drink tea, be happy, and take care. Toodle pip.